Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Big Ideas by XKDR Forum. Our guest for today is Daniel Rothschild. Daniel is the director of the Center for Civics, Education and Opportunity at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Daniel thinks deeply about the relationship between politics and economics, and particularly fiscal policy and government reform. Also a very staunch advocate of India-US relations. So Daniel, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So we are now just talking about a month after former President Donald Trump was re-elected to office. What, in your view, explains this shift and the reason for his victory, and what outcomes do you think are going to be there politically in the coming years?
Well, I think there's a whole lot that we could unpack there, but a couple of things I think are worth digging into. The first is 2024 was said to be the most democratic year in human history. More people on the planet Earth went to vote for state and national governments than at any other time in human history. Of course, it happened here in India as well. My takeaway is that incumbent governments around the world are not popular. And the Biden administration was not popular. So we would have expected that Joe Biden's successor, Kamala Harris, naturally be on the back foot. That said, Trump had a significant victory. He got more than 50% or very close to 50% of the popular vote because he tapped into people's real and growing sense that elites were not listening to them and that institutions were not serving them. And I think the institutions question is really the right way to frame what's going to happen, not just over the next 4 years, but over the next decade or two. The big challenge from my point of view is figuring out which of our institutions are working as intended, which need reform, in some cases substantial reform, and which institutions are no longer fit for purpose and need to be jettisoned. And this is something that's going to be happening across the public sector. It's going to be happening in the private sector. It's going to be happening in education. It's going to be happening in universities. It's going to be happening in civil society groups. So my advice is buckle up.
I mean, that's what Trump's, in a way, right-hand man has been saying, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And speaking of institutions, he decided to create a new department, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. What do you think of this? I mean, in a sense, these guys are not part of government. They've never been part of government. They are tech entrepreneurs DOGE does not even have a formal framework. There's no mandate. From what I understand, they need to provide the recommendations by the middle of next year. Do you think that is something is going to be successful in the sense that would it be able to tap into Trump's campaign promises of making government more efficient, making it leaner and work for the American people?
So I think we've never seen anything quite like DOGE before. So I think that there's a broad variance of potential outcomes. I definitely think it's a good thing that when you bring in people who have been successful in one industry, not that they will know how to run another industry. So I think that that's a fallacy that businessmen know how to run government any more than government mandarins know how to run businesses. But at the same time, having people who come in with a particular background and looking at challenges that other people have been unable to solve, looking at them from a new perspective, a lot of good can come out of that. Now, of course, DOGE is not a statutory body. It's not actually part of the government. It won't actually have any force of law with the recommendations that it makes. So I think really what we're about to learn is how much policymaking can be done by tweeting. So without courts intervening, without any actual regulatory changes, without Congress or any legislative bodies actually doing anything, how much can get done just by persuasion, just by jawboning. So I would say that the jury is out on that. I think the question is, do Elon and Vivek and those working on DOGE come in and truly seek to understand what the incentives are facing people within different bureaucracies and across the government? My overall sense is they have a lot to learn on that because anytime any of us move into a new institutional framework, there's a lot that we need to learn. But we've seen a lot of success on the state level over the last few years with reforming the way that the regulatory state works, with reforming the way that regulations are developed and promulgated and enforced. And the places where we've seen those be most effective are when policymakers come in, really get to understand how the civil service operates, what the incentives are facing people, and then seeks to change those incentives.
Do you think in your mind, would it be easy, or is there going to be some resistance in a sense, to these changes because a civil service has its own way of working.
Any institution, whether it's a university or a Fortune 100 company or a startup or the Department of Commerce, has its own internal logic, has its own internal traditions, has its own way of talking about things. And the only way that people can really make a difference in those kinds of organizations, whether they're big or small, is to understand that language. So I think, yes, there absolutely is a unique logic by which the federal government operates, and specific different parts of the federal government, they operate differently. So I think it's an open question whether or not anyone in DOGE really seeks to understand those human questions associated with it. I'm not excited about what I've seen so far, but they've got a lot of time to dig in. And Elon, in particular, is someone who has had a lot of experience setting different corporate cultures. So again, the fact that he doesn't come in with a lot of background knowledge, the fact that he doesn't come in having been shaped by the same set of expectations that shaped members of the civil service may mean that he'll be able to look at some of these challenges a different way. Now, all of that said, there's limits to how much government efficiency we can actually get just by by stopping waste, fraud, and abuse. The United States is running primary deficits north of $1 trillion right now. Non-uniformed federal employees make around a total of $300 billion a year. So you could fire every single civil servant in the United States, and we would still be running historically massive federal deficits. We would still be facing a federal debt that was well over 120% of GDP. So until you fix those underlying fiscal issues, there's really not that much that you can do to make government more efficient in a way that fixes the fiscal issues that the United States is facing.
Yeah, and time will tell, I guess. I would like to actually know your thoughts even on the way the judiciary will function, because it is one institution where the president has some power, but to nominate judges, but then functions nominally independently. There are two judges who are in their mid-70s, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, both Republican, both might step down, and Trump might be able to nominate two more. So unprecedented, he's already nominated three. Is there any way, say, that Trump will be able to kind of forward his policy even through not forward his policy, but his policy might be validated through a judiciary?
I think there's a good chance that Republicans will end up being a little bit disappointed by the lack of willingness of the federal judiciary to rubber stamp a lot of what they want to do. And that's because the real through line of a lot of Supreme Court jurisprudence, especially over the last few years, has been that Congress needs to do its job. So a lot of the pushback on the regulatory state that we saw in West Virginia versus EPE, Loper-Bright, those were situations that had to do with whether or not agencies were overstepping their boundaries. So the Supreme Court was very clear in West Virginia v. EPA. The EPA would have the authority to regulate climate change, but Congress has to give them the statutory authorization to do that. So I think a lot of what the Trump administration is going to want to do is going to be through executive action. And this is something that we've seen from presidents in both parties for decades now, and it's been ramping up certainly this century. I think that it's likely that the judiciary will step in and tell the president that whether or not the president is Republican or Democrat, whether he is trying to use executive authority to grow the state or shrink the state, that Congress is the first branch mentioned in the Constitution, and that they're the ones who ultimately have to legislate, and that the executive has to follow the laws that Congress has actually written down in black and white.
Finally, I think we could pivot to a little bit of the India-US relationship. Modi and Trump seem to have a good relationship. I think Modi's uttered that famous line, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar," in that Howdy Modi rally in Texas in 2019. But there are underlying issues, the main being trade. Trump has consistently brought up his irritation with the trade deficits. And especially he mentioned India in particular in one of his campaign speeches. Do you think that that is something that could hinder the progress of the relationship?
So I think that we underestimate generally the importance of personal relationships and rapport between leaders. It's not clear that had Reagan and Gorbachev not had the personal relationship that they did, would they have been able to have negotiated effectively a peaceful end to the Cold War, where we won and they lost, as Reagan famously put it. So I think that the personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi is going to be important. But I think to really understand where this relationship is going, we have to look beyond just the next 4 years. The United States is still deeply emotionally, economically, militarily connected with Europe. Europe is in a state of decline. Europe is not producing enough children to keep its population stable. It has not done a particularly good job with inculcating immigrants into the European tradition. And really, you couldn't come up with a better system to get capital and talent to flee your continent than what the European Union has done. There's a reason that every AI company of any import, whether it's run by Americans, Europeans, Indians, Chinese, Japanese, is cited in the United States. So the European Union, demographically and economically, seems bent on its own destruction. And I don't see any way that that gets turned around. Whereas India is going to continue to grow, hopefully economically, certainly demographically. It's becoming a much more important country in both of those regards in a medium-term timescale than China. And I think that we will have a challenge associated with us managing China's demographic decline over the next decade. So when I think about where things are going to be going over the next 20, 30, 40 years, it strikes me that a United States-India alliance is the kind of natural alliance that you would expect between countries that are generally free, market-oriented, and understand that there are global public goods that need to be provided by certain hegemons. So as a friend of mine put it, the future of global hegemony is a U.S.-India axis with the East Asian industrials and Europe stapled on.
And finally, what is your advice to Americans who would want to understand India better?
My advice is to come to India. I'm very glad that I did, but every time I'm here, I learn things, I experience things that I wouldn't otherwise. I think that I've just begun to develop a mental model of how India works, but only at a very surface level. But I highly recommend to anyone, if you can deal with a 14 or 15-hour plane ride, come to India. You will have a wonderful time. You'll meet incredible people. You'll have fantastic experiences. And I think that it's a huge missed opportunity that more Americans aren't spending their holidays, aren't attending conferences, aren't participating in the intellectual and civic life of India, because it's a fantastic country.
Yeah, completely agree. Everyone should come here. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.